Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The ice cracked like knuckles popping in the dark. Not the bad kind of crack that sends you scrambling for shore, but the settling kind. The kind that reminds you there's 30 feet of black water beneath your boots. I should have listened to old Harvey Lundgren when he grabbed my sleeve at the bait shop that morning. His eyes had that wild look, like a deer that's seen headlights coming but can't move. "You heading out to Medicine Lake?" he'd asked, his voice barely above a whisper. When I nodded, he pulled me closer, coffee and tobacco on his breath. "Remember the rules, son. The Minnesota ice fishing rules, not the ones from Fish and Wildlife. The real ones." I laughed it off then. Wish I hadn't. But before I tell you what happened out there on Medicine Lake, before I explain why I'll never drop another line through Minnesota ice, let me ask you something. When you're alone at night and you hear a sound you can't explain, what do you tell yourself? The house settling? The wind? Your imagination? What if you're wrong? What if some things don't want to be explained? Subscribe if you dare to hear the truth, because after this story you'll never look at a frozen lake the same way again. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The story I'm about to tell you. It happened last January. Medicine Lake, about 20 miles northwest of Minneapolis. I'd been ice fishing Minnesota lakes since I was 7 years old, following my grandpa across frozen water thick enough to drive a truck on. Thought I knew everything there was to know. I was wrong. That morning at Lundgren's Bait and Tackle, Harvey wasn't the only one acting strange. The whole place felt off. The regulars huddled near the coffee pot, voices low. When I walked in, conversations stopped. Eyes tracked me to the counter where Betty Lundgren measured out wax worms with shaking hands. "Heading out alone?" she asked. "Yeah, just me today." She exchanged a look with her husband. Harvey shuffled over. That's when he grabbed my sleeve. After his warning about the rules, I tried to laugh. "Come on, Harvey. I know the regulations. 6 lines, house has to be off by March 1st. Not those rules," he interrupted. His fingers dug into my arm. "The old rules. The ones my grandfather knew. The ones we don't talk about anymore because people think we're crazy." Betty touched his shoulder. "Harvey, don't." But he leaned in closer. "First rule, never fish the deep holes after a new moon. Second, if your line goes slack 3 times in a row, pack up. Don't ask why. Just leave." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "And the third rule, if something takes your bait but doesn't fight, cut the line. Don't try to reel it in. Cut it and get off the ice." I pulled free, uncomfortable with the intensity in his eyes. "Sure, Harvey. I'll remember." 20 minutes later, I was driving across Medicine Lake following the plowed road between fishing houses. The ice was 22 inches thick, safe as houses, we say. My spot was way out near the middle, away from the weekend crowd. Just how I liked it. The auger chewed through ice like butter, sending white shavings spiraling up. When it broke through, dark water gurgled up, so black it looked like oil. Just the depth, I told myself. Medicine Lake drops to nearly 60 feet in places. I set up my portable shelter, got the heater running, and dropped my first line. The Vexilar fish finder painted green lines on its circular display, showing my jig at 15 feet, the bottom at 43, a few marks that might be fish. Normal, everything normal. For the first hour. The first bite came around noon. Not the aggressive hit of a walleye or the gentle tap of a perch. This was different. My rod tip dipped once, slow and deliberate, like someone was testing the line. I set the hook, nothing. Reeled in to check my bait, still there, untouched. Dropped it back down. The Vexillar showed something large directly below my jig, not moving side to side like a fish, just there, stationary. I jigged the rod, trying to entice it. The mark on the screen didn't react. Then my line went slack. I reeled up fast, thinking I'd been cut off on the ice edge. But no, the jig was still there. The hook bent, not broken, bent, like someone had carefully reshaped it. That should have been my first warning. I retied with fresh line, new hook, dropped it down again. The mark on the Vexillar was gone. I was just starting to relax when Jerry Olson's voice crackled over the two-way radio. "Anyone else seeing weird readings?" My finder's showing fish at, that can't be right, 70 feet? Medicine only goes to 60 here. Before anyone could respond, his transmission cut to static. Not the normal kind. This static had a pattern to it, like breathing. My line went slack again. This time, when I reeled up, the hook was gone. Not broken off. The knot was still there, perfect, like someone had carefully untied it underwater. That was twice. I remembered Harvey's words. If your line goes slack 3 times in a row, pack up. But I'm stubborn, always have been. Retied again, added a glow jig thinking maybe I needed more attraction in the dark water. The moment it hit bottom, something grabbed it. Not a strike, more like someone gently taking it from my hand. The rod bent steady, no fight, no head shakes, just constant, even pressure. Like reeling in a log, but logs don't move sideways. This thing was moving, circling my hole in a perfect spiral, getting closer with each pass. The Vexillar screen lit up like a Christmas tree. Not one mark, dozens, all rising from the bottom, all moving in that same spiral pattern. My line went vertical. Whatever had my jig was directly beneath the hole now. I could see my line disappearing into the black water, taut as piano wire. Still no fight, just that steady, unnatural pull. I should have cut the line. Rule 3. Harvey's voice echoed in my head. If something takes your bait but doesn't fight, cut the line. But I had to know, had to see. I leaned over the hole, peering into the dark water. The reflection of my shelter's LED lights danced on the surface. Then, the lights went out. Not off, out. Like something below was absorbing them. In that darkness, I saw it. An eye. Not a fish eye. Fish eyes are flat, glassy. This was aware, intelligent, old in a way that made my bones ache. It was looking at me through the 8-inch hole, and I realized it had been watching all along, waiting. My radio exploded with voices, Jerry Olson screaming, other anglers shouting about their lines, their houses, something coming up through the holes. But I couldn't move. That eye held me frozen, and I understood with horrible clarity that the ice wasn't keeping us safe from what was below. It was keeping it trapped. But let me tell you something Harvey never said. Something I only learned later, after the research, after the sleepless nights digging through old records at the Minnesota Historical Society. Medicine Lake wasn't always Medicine Lake. The Ojibwe called it Mashkiki Zagaigan, but that wasn't the original name either. The earliest French trappers who mapped this region in 1659, they marked it as Lac des Yeux Perdus, Lake of the Lost Eyes. Father Jean-Baptiste Marquette wrote in his journal about the natives who lived around that lake, how they'd abandoned their village in the middle of winter, something that never happened, how they burned their fishing nets rather than use them again, how they spoke of the watchers in the deep places who learned human speech by listening at the holes. The French didn't listen, built a trading post anyway. Come spring, when the ice broke up, they found the post empty. Not destroyed, empty. Tools laid out neatly, beds made, food still on the table, but no people, no bodies, no signs of struggle. Just a single journal entry written in Father Marquette's hand, but wrong somehow. The letters too precise, like someone had been practicing his writing. They sing so beautifully below. We understand now why the water is so dark. It is not deep, it is full. That trading post was abandoned for 60 years. When settlers finally came back, they'd forgotten the warnings, forgotten the old name. They called it Medicine Lake because the water was supposed to have healing properties. It did heal, sort of, but healing implies something was broken first. And what lived in that lake, what had always lived there, specialized in breaking things in ways that couldn't be seen from the surface. Harvey's grandfather, Niels Lundgren, came to Minnesota in 1892. Swedish immigrant, tough as boot leather. The kind of man who'd wrestle a bear if it looked at him wrong. But Niels had something the French trappers didn't have. He had the stories from the old country. About curated, about water spirits that collected voices and faces like fishermen collect lures. Niels understood the natives had the right idea. You don't fight things older than memory. You make rules. You make deals. You build boundaries that both sides can respect. The rules, Harvey told me, they weren't arbitrary. They were contract terms. The new moon rule existed because that's when the boundary was thinnest, when things below could see furthest up. The slack line rule was about consent. 3 times meant they were asking permission to come closer. To cut the line after something took your bait, that was acknowledgement. You'd seen something you weren't supposed to see, and both sides agreed to pretend it never happened. For over a century, it worked. But every deal has an expiration date, and ours was tied to something we couldn't control. The ice, every winter a little thinner. Every year the freeze-up coming later, breaking up earlier. The prison walls growing weak. And the things below, they'd been using that time wisely. Learning. Practicing. Getting ready for the day when there wouldn't be enough ice to hold them anymore. I wish Harvey had told me about the 5th rule. The one his grandfather whispered on his deathbed. The one that was never written down because writing it would make it real. Rule 5. When the ice fails, the deal ends. When the deal ends, they come to collect what was promised. And what was promised, back in 1892, when Niels Lundgren was young and desperate and the winter was harsh and his family was starving, he'd promised them the town. When the ice could no longer hold them, when the old boundaries finally failed, Lundgren's descendants would deliver them the people of Medicine Lake. All of them. Every soul who'd benefited from the fishing, from the safety, from the good years of the deal. Starting with the bait shop. Starting with the family who'd kept the rules all these years. Starting with Harvey. The heart attack story? That was for the newspapers. For people who needed simple explanations. But I saw Harvey's body before the coroner took it away. Betty let me into the bait shop's back room where they'd laid him out. His skin wasn't blue from cold. It was gray, empty gray, like something had drained all the color out from the inside. His mouth hung open, and if you looked close, you could see marks on his throat. Not bruises, indentations. Like something had been pulled out of him through his mouth. Something that had been using his vocal cords to practice human speech for over 60 years. Betty showed me the basement after that. The box Harvey had left for his grandson. Inside, maps of every deep lake in Minnesota. Contracts written in a mixture of English, Swedish, and something that hurt to read. And photographs, dozens of them dating back to the 1890s. Pictures of the same faces, decade after decade. People who should have aged, should have died, but didn't. People whose eyes reflected green in the camera flash, even in daylight. People like Jerry Olson, like Tom Morrison, like half the regulars at Lundgren's Bait and Tackle. The deal hadn't just protected the town. It had been recruiting for what came next. And now the ice was too thin. Now the boundaries were failing. Now the collection period had begun. I understood then why Harvey had tried to reinforce the rules one last time. Why he'd gone out on that final night with a new contract, written in his own blood, trying to extend the terms, trying to buy more time. But some things don't negotiate. Some things just wait. And when their time comes, they collect what's owed. With interest. The eye blinked. Have you ever seen something that shouldn't exist? Your brain tries to make sense of it, forces it into familiar shapes. That's what mine did. For a split second, I told myself it was a muskie. Big muskies have eyes that look almost human sometimes, but muskies don't have eyelids. The thing below blinked again, slow and deliberate, and my line started moving up. Not me reeling, the line ascending on its own, coiling at my feet in perfect loops, like something down there was feeding it back to me. Jerry's voice cut through the radio static. "Get off the ice!" Everyone get off the... Then silence. Not static, silence. I jerked back from the hole, survival instinct finally overwhelming curiosity. Through my shelter's windows, I could see other fishing houses. Their lights were going out one by one, starting from the deep end of the lake, moving toward shore like dominoes falling. The temperature dropped. My breath came out in clouds so thick I could barely see. The heater was still running. I could hear it, but the heat was being pulled down through the hole. I watched frost form on the walls, creeping up like reversed melting. Then I heard it, from below. A sound like singing, but not quite. Like voices trying to remember how to be human. The same sound Harvey Lundgren had tried to describe once when he'd had too much bourbon at the VFW. "They sing," he'd said, "the old things in the deep holes. They sing to remind themselves what we sound like. Practice for when they come up." My grandfather had told me stories. Every kid in Minnesota grows up with stories. About the Wendigo, about things that live where the sun doesn't reach. I thought they were just tales to keep kids from playing on thin ice. The singing grew louder. Not from my hole, from all of them. Every hole drilled in Medicine Lake had become a mouth, and they were harmonizing. I grabbed my gear, abandoned everything else. The moment I stepped outside my shelter, I understood why the other houses had gone dark. The anglers were standing beside their holes, perfectly still, looking down into the water. Not moving, not blinking, just watching. Tom Morrison was closest to me, 15 feet away. Retired school teacher, fished here every weekend. His eyes reflected something that wasn't there. A green light from below that made his pupils look like holes themselves. "Tom?" I called out. He turned his head toward me, just his head. His body stayed perfectly still, oriented toward the hole. "They're beautiful," he said. But it wasn't quite his voice. It was his voice trying to remember how to be his voice. They've been waiting so long. Since before the ice, before the water, they just want to come up and see the stars again. "Tom, we need to go. They know the rules," he continued, like I hadn't spoken. "Our grandfathers made the rules to keep them down. But the rules are old, weak, like the ice getting thinner every year. Soon there won't be enough cold, won't be enough ice, and then," he smiled. His teeth had frost on them. "And then they'll come up anyway." I ran, not proud of it, but when Tom's mouth opened wider than any human mouth should, when something started crawling up from his throat that looked like lakeweed but moved like fingers, I ran. The ice was solid under my boots, but it felt thin. Each step sounded like a drumbeat telegraphing my position to whatever was below. Behind me, the singing grew louder. Not beautiful anymore. Hungry. My truck was 300 yards away. Might as well have been 300 miles. The ice between me and shore had changed. The surface was still frozen, but underneath, I could see things moving. Shadows that didn't match anything above them. Shapes that pressed against the ice from below. Testing, probing. I made it 50 feet before my boot went through. Not through the ice, into it. like the surface had become viscous, somewhere between solid and liquid. I pulled free, but my boot stayed behind, absorbed into the ice like it had never existed. That's when I noticed the holes. Not the ones we'd drilled, new ones. Hundreds of them, each perfectly round, about the size of a quarter. They hadn't been there minutes ago. As I watched, more appeared, blooming like flowers in fast forward. Steam rose from each one, but it wasn't warm steam. It was cold, so intense it froze the air itself. Something laughed. Jerry Olson's laugh, but Jerry was 40 yards away, still standing at his hole, his back to me. The laugh was coming from underneath. They were learning. The truck. Just get to the truck. I sock-footed it across the ice, each step careful. Testing. The singing had stopped. Worse. Silence meant they were thinking. Planning. 20 feet from shore, from solid ground, from safety. The ice spoke. Not cracked. Spoke. Words in a language that predated words that made my teeth ache and my eyes water. But somehow, I understood the meaning. The rules are breaking. Harvey had said 3 rules, but there was a 4th. One he hadn't told me because speaking it out loud would make it real. I knew it now, downloaded directly into my brain like cold information. Rule 4. When they come up, don't look back. The shore was right there. 10 feet. 5. Behind me, the sound of breaking glass. Not ice. Glass. Like every window in every fishing house shattering at once. Then, footsteps. Wet footsteps on ice, too many to count, moving in that same spiral pattern. I didn't look back. My truck started on the first try. Miracle. The heater blasted, but I was shaking from more than cold. In the rearview mirror, Medicine Lake looked normal. Fishing houses dotting the ice, a few trucks. Peaceful winter scene. Except nothing was moving. No smoke from heaters. No people. I drove to Lundgren's Bait and Tackle, burst through the door wild-eyed and missing a boot. Harvey took one look at me and poured bourbon into a coffee cup. "You saw them," he said. Not a question. I nodded, unable to speak. They're getting stronger. Every year, less ice, less cold. The rules can't hold them much longer. He stared into his own cup. My grandfather knew. His grandfather, too. They made a deal, you see, way back. The things below stay below, and we get to fish the lakes. But deals require both sides to hold up their end. What was our end? Harvey looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw he'd been carrying this weight his whole life. Winter, he said. We promised them winter. Deep cold, thick ice, prison and sanctuary both. But now, he gestured at the window, at the mild January day, at the world warming degree by degree. Now we're breaking the deal. Betty came from the back room, phone in her hand. Sheriff's heading to Medicine Lake. Says all the anglers they're fine, just fine. Don't remember anything strange. Tom Morrison's asking if you're okay, says you ran off looking spooked. But I'd seen Tom's mouth open, seen something crawling out. They don't remember, Harvey said quietly. That's part of it. They come up, they look through your eyes, learn how to be you. Then they go back down and leave you thinking nothing happened. Except what? Except each time they take a little bit back with them. A memory, a skill, a word. Building themselves into something that can survive up here when the ice is gone for good. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't been back to Medicine Lake. Haven't been on any ice. But I watch the weather reports. This winter's been the warmest on record. Ice out came 2 weeks early, and Jerry's been acting strange. He stands at the boat launch every morning, staring at the open water, mouth moving like he's practicing words he's forgotten how to say. Tom Morrison quit his job, spends his time at the library, reading everything about lake depths, about pressure, about how to breathe in places where breathing shouldn't be possible. And Harvey Lundgren? Harvey died last Tuesday. Heart attack, they said. But Betty told me the truth. He'd gone out onto Medicine Lake one last time, trying to reinforce the rules, she said, trying to make a new deal. They found him beside a hole he'd drilled in the last good ice of the season. Frozen solid, eyes wide open, looking down. But here's the thing. The hole was only 8 inches wide. The medical examiner couldn't explain why Harvey's body had marks like something had tried to pull him through. So that's my story. That's what I saw. Maybe you believe me. Maybe you don't. But if you're ever ice fishing in Minnesota, if you're ever out on a lake when the ice sings and your line goes slack 3 times, remember the rules. The real rules. And whatever you do, whatever you see, don't look down into the holes. Because sometimes, something looks back. Hey, did you hear that? That tapping sound? Like someone knocking on glass. Or ice. You hear it too, don't you? Even though you're nowhere near a lake. Even though you're safe in your home. That's the thing about stories. The true ones. They open holes in places that should stay frozen. They let things through. And once you've heard them, really heard them, you can't unhear them. Check your windows tonight. Check for frost in places where frost shouldn't be. Check for holes the size of quarters, appearing where they shouldn't exist. And if you see an eye looking back, remember Rule 4. Don't look back. Subscribe if you want to know what happened to the others at Medicine Lake. Comment if you've seen something similar at your local fishing spot. Share this, but only with people you trust. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. And if you're Harvey Lundgren's grandson, the one who moved to California in 1998, check your messages. Your grandmother Betty needs to tell you something about your inheritance. About a box in the bait shop basement. About why your grandfather really made you promise never to return to Minnesota. The ice is melting, the rules are breaking, and they're learning how to breathe our air. Sweet dreams. Or maybe don't sleep at all tonight. It's safer that way. Story number 2. The clock on my truck's dashboard blinked 12:34 a.m. when I first heard it. That sound coming from inside the pipeline. Not the usual groans of metal contracting in -40 weather. Not the whistle of Alaskan wind through the support structures. This was different. Rhythmic, deliberate. Like something was trying to communicate from within those 48 inches of steel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before you decide whether to believe what I'm about to tell you, ask yourself this. What would you do if you were alone, 200 miles from Fairbanks, responsible for a section of pipeline that carries 900,000 barrels of oil a day, and you heard something inside that shouldn't exist? Would you report it and risk your job? Or would you do what I did? Investigate it yourself. Comment below if you think you'd be brave enough. Because, after what happened to me and Jake that night, I'm not sure bravery had anything to do with it. Sometimes. Curiosity is just another word for stupidity. The story begins now. My name's Marcus Webb, and for 3 years I worked maintenance on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. The money was incredible. $90,000 a year plus hazard pay. But you earned every frozen penny of it. 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. During those on weeks, you lived in company housing near your assigned section, checking gauges, running diagnostics, making sure America's oil kept flowing south from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez. Most guys hated the isolation. Me, I loved it. After my divorce, the solitude felt like therapy. Just me, the pipeline, and the kind of silence you can only find in Alaska's interior, where the nearest Walmart might as well be on Mars. That December night started like any other. I'd eaten my microwaved Hungry Man dinner, Salisbury steak again, watched a downloaded episode of The Office on my laptop, and geared up for my midnight inspection run. The company required visual checks every 12 hours, even though sensors monitored everything remotely from Anchorage. Old school redundancy, they called it. Jake Morrison, my shift partner, was already out there somewhere, checking the northern section. The thermometer read -38 when I stepped outside, even through my company-issued Arctic gear. Carhartt insulated coveralls, wool base layers, and those ridiculous-looking but life-saving bunny boots. The cold hit like a physical force. My nostril hairs froze instantly. Each breath created little clouds that crystallized and fell like snow. I climbed into the heated Ford F-350, thank God for remote start, and headed out along the service road. The pipeline stretched endlessly in both directions, elevated on its H-frame supports, a silver snake carrying black gold through the wilderness. My headlights caught the yellow warning signs every few hundred yards. Danger, high-pressure pipeline, and no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. 5 miles into my route, I stopped at Pump Station 7 Alpha, just a small building housing monitoring equipment and emergency shutoff valves. The lock was frozen, it always was, so had I used the trick every pipeline worker knew, a small butane torch to heat the mechanism. The door creaked open, and I stepped into relative warmth. 15 degrees inside felt tropical after the deep freeze. I was checking the pressure readings when my radio crackled. "Marcus, you there, buddy?" Jake's voice, but strange, tight. "Yeah, I'm at 7 Alpha. What's up?" A pause, then, You ever hear anything weird out here?" "Define weird, Jake." "Last week I heard what sounded like a woman screaming. Turned out to be a lynx." "No, not animals. From the pipeline. From inside it." I set down my clipboard. Jake had been doing this for 8 years. He wasn't the type to spook easily. "What kind of sound?" "I don't know how to. It's like..." Another pause. "Forget it. I'm probably just tired. Nancy's been on me about taking a desk job back in Anchorage. Maybe she's right." "Jake, where are you?" "Mile marker 42, just past the river crossing. I'll swing by after I finish here." "No, don't. I mean, it's nothing, really. I'll see you back at the station." The radio went silent. I tried calling back but got no response. Not unusual. The radio towers out here were temperamental, especially in winter. But something in Jake's voice bothered me. In 3 years of working together, I'd never heard him sound scared. I finished my checks at 7 Alpha and decided to take the long route back, which would pass Jake's location. The service road was covered in fresh snow, maybe 3 inches since afternoon, and my truck's tracks were the only ones visible. The aurora borealis was out in full force, green curtains dancing across the star-packed sky. On any other night, I would have stopped to watch, but Jake's call had put an uneasy feeling in my gut. Mile marker 42 came up on my right. Jake's truck was there, parked at an odd angle, driver's door open, engine running. The dome light cast a weak yellow glow in the cab. No sign of Jake. I pulled up behind and grabbed my maglite. The big metal one that doubled as a club if needed. "Jake? You out here?" No answer. His footprints led from the truck toward the pipeline, about 30 yards away. I followed them, my breath loud in the silent night. The pipeline loomed above me on its supports, frost coating every surface, making it look like some kind of massive ice sculpture. The footprints stopped directly under the pipeline. There were multiple sets, as if Jake had walked back and forth several times. Then they led to one of the support pillars, where access ladders allowed maintenance crews to reach the top of the pipe. He'd climbed up. "Jake!" I called again, shining my light up at the pipeline. Nothing. Then I heard it. A sound from inside the pipeline. Not the oil flowing. That was a constant, barely audible whoosh you learned to ignore. This was metallic, rhythmic, like someone tapping Morse code on the inside of the pipe. But that was impossible. The pressure in there was enormous. Nothing could survive inside, and even if it could, how would it get in? The tapping stopped, then started again. 3 short taps, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. My blood went cold. And not from the weather. I scrambled up the access ladder, my heavy boots making it awkward. On top of the pipeline, a narrow walkway ran alongside it for maintenance access. Jake's footprints continued along this walkway heading north. I followed for maybe 100 yards before I found him. He was kneeling beside the pipeline, his ear pressed against the frozen metal, eyes wide and unfocused. "Jake, hey, buddy, you okay?" He didn't respond. I grabbed his shoulder and he jerked away like he'd been electrocuted. "Did you hear it?" he whispered. "Did you hear them calling?" "Hear what?" "Jake, you're freezing. Come on, let's get you back to the truck." "No!" He grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Listen. Just listen." Against my better judgment, I knelt beside him. The metal was so cold it burned, even through my insulated gloves. I pressed my ear against the pipeline. At first, just the rush of oil. Then, underneath it, something else. It wasn't Morse code. It was voices. Muffled, distorted by the oil and metal, but definitely voices. Multiple voices. Calling out, pleading, in English. "Help us. Please. We're still alive. It's so dark." I jerked back, my heart hammering. Jake was watching me, tears frozen on his cheeks. "You heard them," he said. It wasn't a question. That's impossible. It's just the oil moving, creating weird acoustics. I've been listening for an hour, Marcus. They know things. They said my daughter's name, Sophie. They knew she just turned 6. They knew about Nancy's mother dying last spring. They know things they couldn't know unless what? Unless they're real. A gust of wind hit us, strong enough to make the pipeline groan. The sound from inside grew louder, more urgent, and I swear I heard my own name. "Marcus Webb, we know about the accident. We know it wasn't your fault. We can tell you who was really driving that night." I scrambled backward, nearly falling off the walkway. The accident, 3 years ago. The reason for my divorce. A hit and run that killed a teenager happened right outside the bar where I'd been drinking. I'd been too drunk to remember leaving. The cops couldn't prove I was driving, but everyone assumed, including my wife, including me. "How?" I whispered. Jake stood up slowly, his movements strange, puppet-like. "They know everything, Marcus. Everything that's happened, everything that will happen. They've been in there so long, flowing with the oil, seeing everything it touches, every car it fuels, every life it powers. Jake, this is insane. We need to call this in." "Call it in?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And say what? That we're hearing voices in the pipeline? They'll drug test us, find nothing, then fire us anyway for mental instability. You know how this works." He was right. The company had zero tolerance for anything that might threaten the pipeline's reputation or operation. Even suggesting something this bizarre would end our careers. "But we can't just ignore it," I said. "I'm not planning to." Jake pulled out a portable angle grinder from his tool bag. "I'm going to cut a small hole. Just enough to see." "Are you insane? The pressure will... The pipeline's 3/4 of an inch thick. I'll just cut through the outer layer, create a small opening in the insulation. Not enough to breach the actual pipe, but enough to hear better." Before I could stop him, he fired up the grinder. The sound was deafening in the Arctic silence. Sparks flew as he pressed it against the pipeline's outer casing. The grinding wheel bit through the insulation easily, too easily. Jake had barely applied pressure when the tool suddenly lurched forward, cutting deeper than intended. He jerked it back, but it was too late. A thin stream of crude oil sprayed out, black as midnight against the snow. "Shut it off!" I screamed, but Jake just stood there transfixed. The oil wasn't behaving normally. Instead of spraying in a steady stream, it was pulsing, forming shapes in the air, almost like hands, reaching hands. The voices were clear now, no longer muffled by steel and oil. They poured out with the crude, a cacophony of pleas and warnings and promises. Free, after so long. The drill found us in 1974, pulled us up with the oil. We're not dead, not alive, something else. Join us, Marcus. The truth about everything is here. Jake dropped the grinder and reached toward the spray. I grabbed him, trying to pull him back, but he was stronger than he should have been. His hand touched the oil, and instantly his whole body went rigid. His eyes rolled back, showing only white. When he spoke, it wasn't his voice. It was multiple voices harmonizing in a way that made my teeth ache. We were workers, like you. Pump Station 3, 1974. The company never reported us missing. Cheaper to say we quit, abandoned our posts. Jake! I shook him, but he continued, the voices pouring out of him. The expansion project. They drilled too deep. Found something older than oil, older than Alaska. It took us, changed us, made us part of the flow. The oil spray was getting worse. Alarms would be going off at the monitoring station. We had minutes before emergency crews arrived. We can show you everything. Every secret, every lie. Just let us in. We're so lonely, so cold. Even hell would be warmer than this. I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled out my emergency patch kit. Every pipeline worker carried one, and slapped a magnetic seal over the leak. It wouldn't hold for long, but it stopped the spray. The moment the oil stopped flowing, Jake collapsed. I caught him before he hit the walkway. His eyes were normal again, but blood was trickling from his nose, already freezing in the cold. "Marcus?" His voice was weak, but his own. What happened?" "We need to go. Now." I half carried, half dragged him back to the ladder. Getting him down was a nightmare. He could barely hold on, but somehow we managed. I got him into his truck, cranked the heat to maximum, and grabbed his radio. "Pipeline emergency. This is Maintenance Team 7 reporting a minor leak at mile marker 42. Temporary patch applied. Requesting immediate repair crew." "Copy that, Team 7. Repair crew dispatched. ETA 40 minutes. Are there any injuries?" I looked at Jake. He was conscious but vacant, staring at something beyond the windshield. "Negative on injuries. We'll wait for the crew. 40 minutes. In 40 minutes, they'd find the leak, fix it properly, and probably commend us for quick action. They'd never know about the voices, about what Jake had heard, about what came through. But I would know, and worse. The things in the pipeline knew I knew. The repair crew arrived in 35 minutes, record time. While they worked, I drove Jake back to the station. He didn't speak the entire way, just stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. I got him inside, made him coffee with enough sugar to wake the dead, and sat with him until his shift supervisor arrived. "Food poisoning," I lied. "Bad batch of that gas station sushi from Fairbanks. He'll be fine after some rest." The supervisor bought it. Food poisoning was common enough out here, where fresh food was a luxury and guys ate whatever didn't need refrigeration. I finished my shift in a daze, filing reports, checking gauges, pretending everything was normal. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard those voices. Saw that oil reaching out like desperate fingers. 3 days passed. Jake didn't come back to work. Word was he'd taken emergency family leave, something about his wife needing surgery. But I knew better. I'd seen that look in his eyes. The look of someone who'd glimpsed something that broke their understanding of the world. On the 4th night, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know if what I'd heard was real, or some kind of hallucination brought on by isolation and cold. I went back to mile marker 42. The repair was perfect. You couldn't even tell where the leak had been. I climbed the access ladder, walked to the spot where Jake had used the grinder, knelt down, put my ear to the cold metal. Silence, just the normal flow of oil. I was about to leave when I heard it. Faint, so faint I might have imagined it. Marcus. I pressed my ear harder against the pipeline. We knew you'd come back. They always come back. Who are you? I whispered. We told you. Workers. Class of 74. Thompson. Rodriguez. Chen. Kowalski. 12 of us. My hand trembled as I pulled out my phone. No signal. Never was out here. But I'd downloaded the company's historical records for offline reading. Long, boring nights led to strange research habits. I searched for 1974, Pump Station 3 missing workers. Nothing. Then I tried a different search. 1974, Trans-Alaska Pipeline construction accidents. There it was. A small mention in a report about construction delays. 12 workers failed to report after Christmas break. Replacements hired. Construction resumed January 1975. No names, no investigation, just a footnote in the pipeline's history. You were real, I breathed. Are real, are here, are eternal now, the thing beneath the oil. It preserves, it connects, it makes us all one. What thing? What's down there? Older than mountains, older than ice. It feeds on the dead things that became oil. Millions of years of death, compressed, liquefied. It woke when they drilled. It's spreading now. In every gas tank, every engine, every plastic product. We're everywhere. My phone buzzed. Impossible. There was no signal, but a text appeared. From Jake's number. Don't trust them, Marcus. They're not the only things in the pipeline. Another text. I did research. 1974 workers were found. Alive, retired in Florida, Arizona, California. Check the pension records. My heart hammered. I searched again, this time in the pension database. There they were. Thompson, Rodriguez, Chen, Kowalski. All 12 names the voices had mentioned. All collecting retirement benefits. All with current addresses. You're lying, I said to the pipeline. The voices changed, became angry, desperate. No. Those are fabrications. Cover-ups. We're here. We're real. Another text from Jake. There's something else. Something that feeds on belief, on fear. The more you believe, the more real they become. Stop listening. Get away. Now. I stood up, backing away from the pipeline. The voices grew louder, more insistent, even though I was no longer touching the metal. Don't leave us. We're so alone, so cold. Marcus, please. They knew my name. But then again, my name was on my work badge. On my truck's registration, in the company database. Things that something intelligent could learn, could use. I ran, slipped on the icy walkway, caught myself, kept running. Down the ladder, to my truck, driving away as fast as safely possible on the frozen road. The radio crackled to life, even though I hadn't turned it on. Marcus, come back. We can tell you about the accident. I turned it off. It turned back on. She was driving, Marcus, your ex-wife. She was driving that night. Let her friend take the blame. We can prove it. I ripped the radio from the dashboard, trailing wires, threw it out the window into the snow. My phone rang. Jake's number again. I answered. Marcus? Jake's real voice, tired but sane. You went back, didn't you? Yeah. They almost got me. Would have if I hadn't. If I hadn't done research. The pipeline's full of things, Marcus. Not ghosts. Something else. Something that feeds on isolation, on paranoia, on the kind of madness that comes from being alone in the dark too long. What do? Nothing. We do nothing. We don't talk about it. We don't think about it. We definitely don't believe in it. That's how it spreads. Through belief, through fear, through stories told by pipeline workers on lonely nights. But, no buts, I'm done. Put in my resignation this morning, moving back to Anchorage, taking that desk job Nancy wanted. You should leave too. I can't afford to leave. This job is all I have. Then forget what you heard. Forget what you saw, and whatever you do, never listen to the pipeline alone. He hung up. I drove back to the station, packed my things, and put in for a transfer to the southern section. More populated, more traffic, less isolation. They approved it immediately. Turns out, mile marker 42 had a high turnover rate. Workers requesting transfers after just a few weeks. Some citing family emergencies, others giving no reason at all. I work near Valdez now, the terminus of the pipeline, where the oil loads onto tankers. There are dozens of workers around at all times. Restaurants nearby, cell phone signal, civilization. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm doing my inspections, I still hear them. Faint, distant, like they're calling from 800 miles away, following the oil as it flows south. They know things they shouldn't know. Things about my coworkers, about accidents that haven't happened yet, about secrets people think are buried. Last week, a new guy asked me if I'd ever heard anything strange from the pipeline. I told him no. Told him it was just his imagination. Told him to get more sleep, eat better, call his family more often. I didn't tell him the truth, because Jake was right. They feed on belief, on fear, on stories. So I'm telling you this story now. At 12:34 a.m., exactly 1 year later. Not because I want you to believe it, but because I need to know I'm not alone. That others have heard them too. Check the time right now. I bet it's 12:34 where you are. That's when they're strongest. When the barrier between what's real and what's possible gets thin. When things that shouldn't exist anyway. Comment if it's 12:34 when you're reading this. Share if you've ever heard something you couldn't explain. Subscribe if you want to hear more about what's really in the Alaska pipeline, because I've only told you about the voices. I haven't told you about what happened to the repair crew that night, or why Pump Station 3 was really demolished in 1982, or what they found when they did seismic testing near mile marker 42 last month. But those are stories for another night, when you're ready, when you're brave enough. For now, just remember, if you ever find yourself alone on a pipeline or near any industrial site where oil flows, and you hear something that shouldn't be there, don't listen, don't believe. And whatever you do, never, ever, let them know you can hear them too. Because once they know you can hear them, they never stop calling. Story number 3. The gas station attendant's fingers were missing their tips. That's the first thing I noticed when he handed me my change at the old Sinclair station just outside Barstow. Not cleanly cut, more like they'd been worn down, eroded, like rocks shaped by wind and time. "You heading east on the 66? He asked, his voice carrying that desert rasp you hear in folks who've spent too many years breathing dry air. "Planning to," I said, pocketing the change, following it all the way to Chicago. Always wanted to do the whole route. He made a sound, not quite a laugh. More like air escaping from something punctured. "Funny thing about Route 66, he said, wiping those strange, shortened fingers on his coveralls. "They decommissioned it back in '85, officially, anyway. But roads, real roads, they don't just end because someone takes down the signs." I smiled politely, the way you do when locals start getting philosophical. But then he leaned in closer, and I could smell motor oil and something else. Something like burnt copper pennies. "They say it never really ended," he whispered. "Just continues somewhere else. You drive long enough on the old road, especially at night, sometimes you find where it really goes. Listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Because 3 days later, I found out exactly what he meant. And if you're listening to this late at night, maybe check your windows. Make sure you're still where you think you are. The story begins now. My name is Marcus, and I'd been planning this trip for 3 years. Ever since Dad died, actually. He'd always talked about driving Route 66, the whole thing, end to end. Chicago to Santa Monica, 2,448 miles of pure Americana. We were going to do it together after I graduated college, but, well, cancer doesn't wait for graduation ceremonies. So there I was, 32 years old, driving his restored 1967 Chevrolet Impala, the one we'd worked on together every weekend for 5 years, heading east from California on an October evening when the desert had that particular quality of light that makes everything look like an old photograph. The first day was perfect. Stopped at Roy's Motel and Cafe in Amboy, took pictures at the Baghdad Cafe, all the tourist stuff Dad had marked in his old guidebook, the one from 1979 that still sat on the passenger seat, held together with rubber bands and hope. It was the second night when things started to feel different. I'd passed through Flagstaff and was heading toward Holbrook. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of rust and purple. The kind of sunset that makes you understand why people write songs about this part of the country. The radio was playing oldies, the Eagles, Creedence, all Dad's favorites, when it happened. The static came first, just a whisper of it, cutting through Hotel California. Then the road sign. Route 66, next right. Which was impossible. I was already on Route 66, had been for miles. The old alignment ran straight through here. I'd checked the maps 3 times. Dad's guidebook, Google Maps, even an old AAA road atlas from 1982 I'd found at an antique shop. But there it was. White letters on green metal, looking fresh as if it had been installed yesterday. I slowed down. The logical part of my brain said it was probably just some tourist trap, maybe a museum or gift shop using the old highway's name to draw in travelers like me. But the radio static got worse. Through it, I could hear something. Music, but wrong. Like someone playing a familiar song in a minor key. Get your kicks on Route 66, but stretched and distorted, as if the tape was melting. I took the turn. I want you to understand, I'm not impulsive. I plan everything. I had hotel reservations for every night of this trip. I'd calculated fuel stops. I'd even packed specific snacks for specific stretches of road. But something about that sign, something about the way the light hit it, made me turn that wheel. The road was smooth, too smooth. Modern highways have seams, imperfections, patches where work crews have filled potholes. This was like driving on glass, black asphalt that seemed to swallow the headlights instead of reflecting them. After about 3 miles, I saw lights ahead. Another gas station, but not a Shell or Chevron or any brand I recognized. The sign just said fuel in red neon that buzzed and flickered like dying fireflies. I needed gas anyway. The gauge had been sitting at a quarter tank for the last 50 miles, which was weird because I'd filled up in Flagstaff and the Impala usually got decent mileage on the highway. The station looked like something from the 50s, not restored or maintained. More like it had been hermetically sealed in 1957 and just opened yesterday. Chrome pumps with the rolling numbers. A bell that actually rang when I drove over the rubber hose. And an attendant who came walking out of the office with a smile that was too wide and eyes that didn't blink enough. "Evening, traveler," he said. His uniform was crisp, white with red trim. Name tag said Jim, but the letters looked unstable, like they were trying to spell something else but couldn't quite manage it. "How far are you heading tonight?" "Holbrook," I said. "Maybe Gallup if I feel like pushing it." He laughed. The sound made my teeth ache. "Oh, you can push it as far as you like on this road. It goes all the way through, all the way to where it was always meant to go." I handed him my credit card, but he waved it away. "No need for that here." The road provides for its travelers, always has. The pump clicked and whirred as he filled the tank. I watched the numbers roll. Except they weren't showing gallons or dollars. They showed miles, counting backward. 2,448, 2,447, 2,446. "That's—" I started to say. "The distance remaining," Jim said, still with that too-wide smile. "The road knows where you're going. It's been waiting for you, been waiting for a lot of folks who had promises to keep." My mouth went dry. I'd never told him about Dad, never mentioned why I was making this trip. "Your father would be proud," he continued, hanging up the pump. "The road remembers everyone who ever loved it. Sometimes it brings them back. You just have to drive far enough to find where they've been waiting." I got back in the car, hands shaking, and drove away without saying another word. In the rear-view mirror, I watched the station lights flicker and fade until there was nothing but darkness behind me. The road ahead stretched on. The radio had gone completely silent now, not even static. Just a thick, oppressive quiet that made my breathing sound too loud. The headlights seemed dimmer, only illuminating maybe 20 feet ahead. That's when I saw the first one. A car on the side of the road. Another classic, looked like a '57 Thunderbird. Mint condition if you didn't count the fact that it was semi-transparent. I could see the desert through it, like looking through colored glass. There was someone in the driver's seat. They turned to look at me as I passed, and I had to grip the steering wheel to keep from swerving. It was a woman, maybe 40 years old, wearing a pillbox hat and pearl necklace. She smiled and waved. She had no eyes, just smooth skin where they should have been. I kept driving. What else could I do? When I tried to slow down, the car seemed to resist, like it wanted to maintain exactly 66 miles per hour. The speedometer needle sat there, unwavering, no matter how much I pressed or released the gas pedal. More cars appeared, all classics, all with that same translucent quality. A Studebaker with a family of 4, all missing their faces. A Volkswagen van painted with flowers, its occupants nothing but shadows that moved wrong. A Model T that shouldn't even have been on Route 66. The road wasn't built until 1926, but there it was, its driver a thing of smoke and suggestions. The road began to change too. Side streets appeared that led to towns I'd never heard of. Adamsville, Reflected Lake, New Mercy. The signs were in English, but reading them made my eyes water, like trying to focus on something that existed in more dimensions than 3. Then I saw the diner. The Midnight Mile Cafe sat at what looked like a major intersection, though my GPS showed nothing but empty desert. The parking lot was full of cars from every era. Model Ts next to Teslas, horses tied to a post next to motorcycles that looked like they were from some future that never happened. I needed to stop, needed to think, needed to figure out what was happening. The Impala's engine was running rough anyway, making a sound like whispered words in a language I didn't recognize. The diner's neon sign flickered between open and something else, letters that hurt to perceive. But the windows glowed warm and yellow, and I could see people inside. Normal people, eating pie and drinking coffee like any roadside diner in America. I parked between a 1948 Packard and what looked like a car, but was really just the idea of a car. all wrong angles and impossible geometries. The bell above the door played the first 3 notes of Route 66 when I walked in. The smell hit me immediately. Coffee, bacon, apple pie. But underneath it, something else. Like ozone. Like the air before a thunderstorm that never quite arrives. "Sit anywhere you like, hun," called a waitress. She looked normal, completely normal, except for her shadow, which was pointing the wrong direction and had too many arms. I took a booth by the window. The menu was already on the table, but the items kept changing when I wasn't looking directly at them. Today's special, memory pie, fresh-caught dreams, coffee from before the accident. "You look lost, friend." The man who slid into the booth across from me wore a crisp Air Force uniform from what looked like the 1940s. He was handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way you see in old recruitment posters, but his eyes were older than his face, much older. "I'm just trying to get to Chicago," I said. He laughed, but it was sad. "Aren't we all?" "I've been trying to get home since 47. Took a wrong turn somewhere around Amarillo. Or maybe it was the right turn. Hard to tell on this road." "What road is this?" He leaned forward. "The real Route 66. The one they built on top of all the old paths. Native trails. Spanish trade routes. Ghost roads that existed before humans ever walked this land. You can pave over them, decommission them, tear them up, but roads like this don't die. They just sink deeper. And sometimes when the conditions are right, when the light hits just so, and you're carrying enough sadness or hope or unfinished business, you find the old road, the one that goes everywhere, every when." The waitress appeared with coffee I hadn't ordered. The mug was warm, but the coffee inside was cold. Had always been cold, would always be cold. "Your father's been through here," the airman continued. "About 3 years ago, local time, though time's negotiable on this stretch." My heart stopped, started, stopped again. "That's impossible." "Is it?" He gestured around the diner. "Look closer at the other customers." I did, and now I could see it. They were all traveling, not just physically. They were in motion between states of being. The family in the corner booth kept flickering between alive and dead. The trucker at the counter aged and grew younger with each bite of his sandwich. The teenage couple in matching Letterman jackets were there and not there, kissing and vanishing and reappearing. "Everyone on this road is trying to get somewhere," the airman said. "Some are trying to get back to when they were happy. Some are trying to reach a future that never came. And some," he looked directly at me, "some are trying to keep promises to the dead." "I just wanted to finish his trip," I whispered. "And you will. The road always delivers its travelers. But the question is, which version of Chicago do you want to reach? The one where he's waiting? Or the one where you properly said goodbye?" Before I could answer, the diner's lights flickered. Everyone, everything, froze, except for the airman, who stood up slowly. "Time to go," he said. "He's coming." "Who?" "The attendant. The one who maintains this road. He doesn't like it when travelers stay too long in one place. The road must keep moving, always moving." Through the window, I saw him, walking down the center line of the highway, tall, impossibly tall, wearing a uniform that belonged to no gas company that ever existed. His face was a blur, like someone had taken an eraser to reality, and where his feet touched the asphalt, the road cracked and reformed, in an endless cycle of destruction and repair. "Run," the airman said. "Get in your car and drive. Don't stop, don't look back. And whatever you do, don't let him fill your tank." I ran, threw myself into the Impala and turned the key. The engine roared to life, no, screamed to life. A sound of protest and recognition combined. The gas gauge, which had been sitting at 3/4 full, suddenly dropped to E. Behind me, the diner dissolved. Not destroyed, dissolved. Like sugar in water, it simply stopped being solid and became part of the liquid darkness that was spreading across the intersection. The other cars in the parking lot started their engines in unison, a symphony of different eras of automotive history, and peeled out in every direction. In the rearview mirror, the attendant stood where the diner had been. He raised one arm, too long, jointed in too many places, and pointed at me. The road beneath the Impala began to ripple. I floored it. The speedometer climbed, 66, 77, 88, 99. But the numbers meant nothing here. Speed was relative. Distance was negotiable. The only constant was the road, unspooling before me like a black tongue, always just barely visible in the dying headlights. The radio exploded with sound. Not music, voices. Hundreds of them, thousands. Everyone who'd ever driven this road and gotten lost. They were all talking at once, telling their stories, warning about exits that led nowhere, celebrating roads that led everywhere. Through it all, I heard him. Dad. Should have seen the sunrise at Cadillac Ranch, Marcus. Painted our names on one of the cars. Would have loved it. Still waiting at mile marker. The sound cut out as something slammed into the back of the Impala. I looked back. Nothing there. But the trunk was crumpled inward, as if hit by something massive and invisible. Another impact. The rear window spiderwebbed but didn't shatter. Through the cracks I could see the attendant. He wasn't running, wasn't driving. He was simply there, then not there, then there again. Closer each time. Teleporting number. He was folding the road, bringing the space behind me closer with each fold. The engine coughed. The gas gauge needle didn't just read empty. It had gone past E into some impossible negative space on the dial. The Impala was running on something other than gasoline now. Memory, maybe, or intention, or fear. Mile markers flashed by in the wrong order. 1,502, 847, 2,449, -15. Infinity. Then I saw it ahead. Another gas station. Not the modern one where this had all started. This was ancient. The pumps were hand-cranked. The building was made of something that might have been adobe or might have been compressed time, and standing beside the pumps was Dad? It looked like him, exactly like him, the way he'd looked before the cancer, healthy, smiling, wearing his favorite Roadrunner t-shirt and jeans. He waved at me to pull in. Every instinct screamed no. This was wrong. This was a trap. But the engine was dying. Already, I could feel the Impala slowing despite my foot pressed to the floor, and the attendant was getting closer. I could see his not face in perfect clarity now, a constantly shifting arrangement of features that never quite resolved into anything human. I turned into the station. Dad, or the thing wearing his appearance, grabbed the pump handle, but instead of putting it in the gas tank, he held it out to me. "You have to choose, son," he said in Dad's voice. "Fill her up, and you can stay on this road forever. We can finish the trip together. Every mile of it, every town, every sunset. Just like we planned." "You're not him," I said. He smiled sadly. "No, but I remember him. The road remembers everyone who ever loved it. I can be him for you, forever if you want. That's what this road offers, the chance to drive through your dreams instead of past them." The attendant was at the edge of the station now, standing just outside the circle of light, waiting. "Or," the dad thing continued, "you can refuse, turn around, try to find your way back. But the road doesn't like to let go of its travelers, and without fuel," he gestured at the attendant, "he maintains the road, clears away the broken-down vehicles, processes them back into the asphalt. You'd become part of Route 66. Literally. Forever. I looked at the pump in his hand, at the attendant waiting in the darkness, at the Impala's dashboard, where every gauge was now reading impossible values, and I made my choice, but not the one they expected. I grabbed Dad's guidebook from the passenger seat. The one from 1979, held together with rubber bands and hope and something else, love, memory. The real kind, not the manufactured dreams this road was offering. The road remembers everyone who ever loved it, I said. But it doesn't understand the difference between love and obsession, between memory and prison. I opened the book. Every page was filled with Dad's handwriting. Notes about good diners, reminders to check the oil, jokes he wanted to tell me at specific mile markers. And on the last page, written in shaky handwriting from his final days, "Don't drive for the dead, son. Drive for the living. The road ends where it needs to." I tore out that page and held it up. The Dad thing stepped back. The attendant froze, and the road itself seemed to hold its breath. "He finished his trip," I said. "Maybe not the way he planned, but he finished it. And I don't need to drive his dreams. I need to drive my own." I lit the page with the Impala's cigarette lighter. It burned with colors that don't exist in normal fire. Blue, green, purple something beyond ultraviolet. The flame spread to the guidebook, and I threw it onto the asphalt. The road screamed. Reality folded. Unfolded. Refolded. The gas station aged 1,000 years in seconds, crumbling to dust. The attendant split into multiple versions of himself, each one maintaining a different possible road. And the Dad thing, for just a moment, as it dissolved, it was really him, not a copy or a memory or a trick of the road. Him. He smiled, a real smile, not the too wide grimace of this place, and nodded. "Drive safe," he said. Then everything went white. I woke up in the Impala, parked at a rest stop on I-40. The real I-40. The sun was rising, painting the desert in normal colors. Beautiful, but normal. My phone showed 17 missed calls from my mom, wondering why I hadn't checked in from Holbrook as planned. The gas tank was full. The odometer showed I'd driven exactly 0 miles since Flagstaff. But the guidebook was gone. In its place, on the passenger seat, was a single Polaroid photograph. It showed Dad and me, standing next to the Impala at what looked like the end of Route 66 in Chicago. The Grant Park. Buckingham Fountain in the background. We were both smiling. The photo was dated 3 days in the future. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were coordinates, not for Chicago, for something else, someplace else. And below that, a note. Every road ends, but endings are just beginnings, viewed from the wrong direction. The real Route 66 never ended. It just learned to let go. I kept that photo, still have it, but I never went to those coordinates. Some roads don't need to be driven. Some trips don't need to be finished. And some promises are kept by knowing when to stop. I drove home on the interstate. Boring. Safe. Real. And that night, I had a dream. Dad and I were working on the Impala, like we used to. And he said something I'll never forget. The best trips aren't about reaching the destination. They're about knowing when you've gone far enough. The thing is, I still see it sometimes. The turnoff. The impossible exit to the road that goes everywhere and nowhere. It appears on foggy nights, or when the sun sets just right, or when I'm driving alone and the radio starts to static. The sign is always there. Route 66, next right. And sometimes, God help me, sometimes I can see other cars taking that exit. Drivers who have their own promises to keep, their own dead to chase, their own dreams of roads that never end. I wonder if they ever find what they're looking for. I wonder if what they're looking for finds them first. And late at night, when I can't sleep, I check that Polaroid. We're still there, Dad and me, at the end of Route 66 in Chicago. Still smiling, still together in a future that never happened. And I realize, maybe the road doesn't trap you. Maybe it offers you exactly what you think you want. And the real horror isn't getting lost on an endless highway. It's realizing that part of you never wants to be found. They say Route 66 never ended. And now I know they're right. It's still out there, running parallel to our world, collecting travelers, processing dreams, maintaining itself through the attendant and others like him. So, if you're driving late at night, if you see that impossible exit, if your radio starts playing songs that sound familiar but wrong, just keep driving. Don't take the turn. Don't stop at the old gas stations. Don't trust the attendants with their too wide smiles and shortened fingers. Unless you have promises you can't let go of. Dreams you can't stop chasing. Dead you can't stop mourning. Then maybe, just maybe, that road is exactly where you belong. But remember, the road always gets its due. It feeds on nostalgia, grows strong on unfinished business, and paves itself with the souls of those who can't let go. They say Route 66 never ended. The truth is worse. It's waiting, and it's hungry. And every time someone takes that turn, following their headlights into that impossible darkness, it grows a little longer, a little stronger, a little more real. Sweet dreams, travelers. And if you hear your engine running in the middle of the night, if you find your car keys moved from where you left them, if you wake up with the smell of hot asphalt and old motor oil in your nose, maybe check your odometer. You might have been driving in your sleep. The road always finds a way. It always has. It always will. Story number 4. My flight was delayed 17 hours. That's how it started. Not with some grand revelation or mysterious encounter, but with a mechanical issue on United Flight 447 from Chicago to Seattle. The gate agent at Denver International Airport gave me that practiced smile, the one they save for stranded passengers, and handed me a meal voucher worth $12. $12 in an airport where a bottle of water costs $7. But here's the thing about being stuck in DIA overnight. You start noticing things that the rushing crowds with their rolling suitcases and screaming toddlers never see, things that maybe weren't meant to be seen at all. The airport transforms after midnight. The retail shops pull down their metal gates with that particular scraping sound that echoes through empty terminals. The announcements become less frequent, more hollow. Even the air feels different, thinner, charged with something I couldn't name then but recognize now. It's the weight of secrets, of hidden purposes, of time itself bending around this place like light around a black hole. Before I tell you what happened that night, let me ask you something. Have you looked at those murals? I mean, really looked at them. Not the quick glance as you hurry to your gate, not the Instagram photo for your travel blog, but studied them, the way you'd study a map if you were lost in the wilderness. Because that's what they are. Maps, instructions. And I followed them. Now the story begins. The terminal was different at 2 a.m. The usual chaos had died down to a whisper, leaving just us overnight refugees scattered across the uncomfortable seats like discarded luggage. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency that made my teeth ache. I'd already walked the length of Concourse B twice, eaten my pathetic voucher meal, a soggy sandwich and overpriced chips, and attempted to sleep using my backpack as the world's worst pillow. That's when I saw Marcus. He wasn't sleeping either. While everyone else had claimed their little territories of misery, he was standing in front of that first mural. You know the one. Peace and harmony with nature. The one with the soldier in the gas mask. His nose was almost touching the glass, and his fingers traced something in the air. There was something ritualistic about his movements, like he was performing a ceremony I didn't understand. His lips moved silently, counting or chanting, I couldn't tell which. The way he stood there, completely still except for those tracing fingers, reminded me of how my grandmother used to read her Bible. Not just reading the words, but searching for deeper meaning between the lines. "Can't sleep either?" I asked, walking up beside him. He didn't turn, didn't even acknowledge me at first. Then, "Do you see it?" "See what?" His finger pointed to the bottom corner of the mural. The numbers, hidden in the pattern of the floor tiles in the painting. Look closer. I leaned in, my breath fogging the protective glass. At first I saw nothing but painted tiles, abstract patterns that looked like the kind of thing you'd find in any public building. Then, there, barely visible unless you knew where to look, a sequence, 39.8561 degrees north, 104.6737 degrees west. The numbers seemed to shimmer once I focused on them, as if they were pleased to finally be noticed. A chill ran down my spine, not from the airport's aggressive air conditioning, but from something deeper. Recognition, like finding a note written in your own handwriting that you didn't remember leaving. "GPS coordinates," Marcus said. "They're all over these murals if you know how to look." Been coming here for 3 years now. Different flights, different delays, but I always end up here overnight. And each time, I find more. More what? He finally looked at me. His eyes had that glassy, sleep-deprived shine, but underneath was something else. Fear? Excitement? The kind of manic energy that comes from staying awake too long on a discovery that consumes you. I'd seen it in graduate students pulling all-nighters before thesis defenses and conspiracy theorists convinced they'd found the smoking gun. Instructions. They're not paintings about peace and war and harmony. They're a manual, a guide, for something that hasn't happened yet. The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, so certain, made my stomach turn. I should have walked away, should have found another spot to wait out my delay. But 17 hours is a long time, and Marcus had a notebook. Pages and pages of coordinates, symbols, timestamps, all pulled from the murals. "This one," he said, flipping to a page covered in sketches. His handwriting was meticulous, almost obsessive. Arrows connecting symbols, mathematical calculations in the margins, dates circled and crossed out and circled again. The rainbow coming from the soldier's gun, count the colors. Not 7 like a real rainbow, 9. And if you assign each color a number, then convert those numbers to letters. You get words, I finished, suddenly seeing it. The pattern was there, undeniable once pointed out. Like those optical illusion pictures where you stare and stare until suddenly a 3D image pops out, and then you can't unsee it. He smiled. "Smart." Most people think I'm crazy by now, but you see it too, don't you? I did. God help me, I did. We spent the next 2 hours going through his notes. Each mural had layers. Surface images that tourists photographed. Hidden symbols that connected to Denver's underground tunnels. Yes, those tunnels everyone jokes about. And beneath that, something else. Something that made my skin crawl. Marcus showed me how the figures in the murals weren't randomly placed. Their positions corresponded to constellation maps, to architectural blueprints, to geological surveys of the Denver area. The children, in peace and harmony with nature, stood at points that matched the exact layout of the airport's baggage handling system. The dead soldier's sword pointed directly to the coordinates of the airport's deepest subbasement. "Look at this." Marcus pointed to a sketch he'd made of the second mural, the one with the dead children. "See the pattern on the little girl's dress? It's not random, it's binary code, translates to a date, December 21st, 2025. My phone buzzed. I glanced at it, December 19th, 2024, 4:17 a.m. That's next month, Exactly. And look here. He flipped pages frantically. Every hidden date in these murals points to the same week. December 21st through 28th. 7 days. And the coordinates. They don't just mark locations. They mark a path. A path to what? Marcus looked around the empty terminal. A janitor pushed a cart in the distance, but something was wrong with his movement. Too regular, too mechanical. The security guard walked past again. I was sure it was the same one from an hour ago, wearing the same slightly wrinkled uniform, taking the same measured steps. That's what I've been trying to figure out. But I think it starts here. In the airport, during those 7 days, something's going to happen, and these murals, they're telling us where to be. Or, his voice dropped, where not to be. I should have gone back to my seat. Should have put in my earbuds and waited for morning like a normal person. But Marcus had something. Call it sleep deprivation, call it boredom, call it whatever you want. But those patterns were real. We moved to the third mural. In peace and harmony with nature, the one everyone says is hopeful. Children gathering around a glowing plant, animals living in harmony. But Marcus showed me something else. Count the children, he said. 15. Now, count the animals. 21. 15th to 21st of March, 15th to 21st. The spring equinox. But look at their positions. He pulled out his phone, opened a star chart app. If you map where each child and animal stands in relation to the glowing plant in the center, the app showed constellations, swirling patterns of stars that looked almost organic in their complexity. Marcus overlaid the mural's composition onto the star map, and the match was perfect. Too perfect. It matches the constellation positions for December 21st, 2025, I breathed. At exactly 3:33 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, right here in Denver. My hands were shaking now. This wasn't random, couldn't be. The level of detail, the interconnected symbols, the mathematical precision. It was like discovering that every book in a library had been written by the same author, telling parts of one massive story. Who painted these? I asked. Leo Tanguma, local artist. But here's the thing. Marcus pulled up an interview on his phone. The video was grainy, clearly recorded years ago. Tanguma looked nervous, kept glancing off camera as he spoke. He says he was given specific instructions, specific themes, by a committee. And no one knows who was on that committee. The airport commission has no record of it. In the interview, Tanguma's hand shook as he described the commission. Anonymous figures in expensive suits who met him in hotel rooms, never the same room twice. They provided him with detailed sketches, color specifications, even the exact chemical composition of certain paints. When he asked about the symbolism, they told him it wasn't his concern. Just follow the instructions. They paid him in cash, Marcus added. Large bills, sequential serial numbers, and when he tried to research the committee later to understand what he'd created, nothing. No records, no names, like they never existed. We kept digging. The fourth mural, the one people call the most disturbing. Children from around the world bringing weapons to a German boy who's hammering them into plowshares. But the boy's position, the angle of his hammer, the specific weapons being destroyed, they formed another set of coordinates. This one's different, Marcus said. It's not a place. It's underground. Depth measurements. 247 feet below ground level. The tunnels. Deeper than the tunnels, there's something else down there. That's when I noticed it. The security guard who'd passed us earlier. He'd passed us again. Same route, same pace, like he was on a loop. But this time, I saw his face clearly in the fluorescent light. It was the same face as one of the children in the mural. Older, grayer, but unmistakably the same bone structure, the same eyes. "Marcus," I whispered. "We're being watched." He didn't look up. They always watch, but they never stop me. 3 years and they never stop me. Know why? Why? Because they want someone to figure it out. These instructions, they're not for everyone. They're for the ones who can see, the ones who are supposed to. He stopped mid-sentence. His face went pale. Supposed to what? He pointed at the mural. There, in the corner I hadn't noticed before, was a figure. Small, almost hidden among the children. But this one was different. This one was facing out, looking directly at the viewer, looking directly at us. And its face was mine. I stumbled backward, hit my shin on one of those metal benches. The pain was real, sharp, grounding. But that face in the mural, "That's not possible," I said. Marcus was taking pictures now, his hands steady despite everything. The camera flash reflected off the glass, creating strange double exposures that made the figures in the mural seem to move. "It wasn't there before. I've photographed every inch of these murals. That figure, it's new." "Murals don't change, Marcus. Paint doesn't just, 'Look again.'" I did. The figure was still there, but now it was pointing. Its tiny painted hand directed toward the far end of the terminal, toward the construction walls they'd put up near Gate B87. The gate that had been closed for renovations for 6 months. The pointing gesture was so subtle I almost missed it, but once I saw it, it was impossible to ignore. The figure's arm was raised at exactly 33 degrees from horizontal, a number that kept appearing in Marcus's calculations, and the direction it pointed. When I traced the line with my eye, it led past sleeping passengers, past empty shops, past all the normal airport infrastructure to that one spot where reality seemed to thin. "We need to go," Marcus said. "Go where?" "This is insane. I'm seeing things. Sleep deprivation, that's all this is." But even as I said it, I was following him. Because deep down, in that primal part of your brain that still remembers when we were prey, I knew something was happening, something that had been planned for a very long time. The terminal stretched before us, impossibly long at this hour. Our footsteps echoed despite the carpet. The few travelers sleeping in chairs didn't stir as we passed. It was like moving through a photograph, everything frozen except us. As we walked, I noticed more details. The digital clocks all showed slightly different times, never more than a few minutes apart, but enough to create a disorienting sense that time itself was unreliable here. The departure boards flickered occasionally, showing flights to cities I'd never heard of. New Geneva, Port Meridian, Clockwork Falls. Then they'd flicker back to normal destinations. Gate B87 was wrapped in white construction plastic. "Pardon our progress." The sign read, in cheerful blue letters, "Enhanced gate experience coming soon." Marcus didn't hesitate. He found a gap in the plastic and slipped through. I followed. The space beyond was wrong. Not under construction, abandoned. The windows were painted black from the inside, the paint applied in careful, deliberate strokes. The seats had been removed, leaving bolt holes in the floor like tiny mouths. And in the center, where the gate desk should have been, was a service elevator I'd never seen before. The elevator was clearly old, much older than the airport itself. Its brass fittings had the patina of decades, and the floor indicator above the door showed not numbers but symbols. The same symbols from the murals. "This isn't on any airport map," Marcus whispered. The elevator doors were open. Waiting. I know what you're thinking. Don't get in the elevator, that's horror movie 101. But standing there in that impossible space that shouldn't exist, I realized something. The murals weren't warning us away. They were inviting us in. And that figure with my face, it wasn't appearing in the mural. It had always been there. I just hadn't been ready to see it until now. We got in the elevator. There were no buttons, just a single lever that said down. Marcus pulled it. The descent took forever, or maybe just seconds. Time felt elastic, stretched like taffy. The elevator didn't shake or rattle. It dropped smooth as silk, and I counted my heartbeats. 50, 100, 200. My ears should have popped from the pressure change, but they didn't. Instead, I felt something else. A subtle shift in reality, like tuning a radio to a clearer station. The air grew cooler, more humid, carrying scents of earth and ozone and something else. Something that reminded me of old churches, of stone worn smooth by centuries of faithful hands. When the doors opened, we were in a corridor. Concrete walls, fluorescent lights, and that distinct underground smell. Earth and electricity and something else. Something organic. The tunnels, I said. No, Marcus corrected. Below the tunnels. This is what they were really building when they made this airport. The tunnels were just the cover story. The corridor branched in 4 directions, each path marked with a symbol I recognized from the murals. The soldier's gas mask, the rainbow, the burning forests, the dove with the olive branch. Which way? I asked. Marcus consulted his notebook, cross-referenced coordinates and symbols. The dove. If I'm reading this right, it leads to the source. The source of what? He looked at me with those exhausted, terrified, exhilarated eyes. The instructions. Who's been leaving them? And why December 21st matters. We took the dove path. The corridor curved gradually, spiraling deeper. The lights grew dimmer, spaced further apart. And then we heard it. Humming. Not mechanical, human. Multiple voices in harmony, the sound echoing off the concrete until it seemed to come from everywhere. Marcus, keep walking. The humming had a hypnotic quality, rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost mathematical. It reminded me of Gregorian chants, but older somehow. More primal. The kind of sound humans might have made around fires before language, before civilization. When music was magic and magic was survival. The corridor ended at a door. Metal, unmarked, with a small window at eye level. The humming was coming from inside. I looked through the window first. I wish I hadn't. The room beyond was vast, bigger than the terminal above. Row after row of seats like an underground amphitheater, all facing a wall covered in screens. Hundreds of screens showing every corner of the airport. But that wasn't what made my blood freeze. The seats were occupied. People sat perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the screens. Men, women, all different ages, all wearing the same gray coveralls. And they were humming, that harmonious sound that made my teeth ache. But as I looked closer, I noticed something else. They weren't just watching the screens, they were responding to them. When a screen showed a passenger approaching the murals, the watchers would lean forward slightly. When someone walked away without really looking, they would relax. It was like watching a conductor's orchestra, each screen a different instrument, each watcher a different note in some vast, incomprehensible symphony. "Marcus," I whispered. "We need to leave now." But he was already opening the door. The humming stopped instantly. Every head turned toward us. Hundreds of faces, all with the same blank expression, and then they smiled. All at once, the exact same smile. "You found it," they said in unison. Their voices layered, creating harmonics that shouldn't be possible. "You followed the instructions." A woman in the front row stood up, walked toward us with mechanical precision. As she got closer, I realized why she looked familiar. It was the gate agent. The one who'd given me the meal voucher 17 hours ago, except that felt like days ago now. Weeks, maybe. "How long have we been down here?" I asked Marcus. He checked his phone. The screen was black. Dead. "Time moves differently here," the woman said. but her lips didn't match the words, like she was badly dubbed. December 21st is in 3 days, or 3 years, or it already happened. The murals show all timelines. What are you? I managed to ask. We're the Watchers. The recorders. We've been here since they built the airport. Waiting. Recording. Preparing. Preparing for what? She tilted her head. That synchronized smile again. For you to follow the instructions. Someone always does. Every timeline, someone finds the patterns. Follows the path. Arrives here. And then what happens? You choose. The screens behind her changed, no longer showing the airport. Now they showed the murals. But these were different. Alive. The figures moved. The soldier removed his mask, revealing nothing underneath. The children around the glowing plant aged rapidly, turned to dust, reformed as children again, the cycle repeating endlessly. The murals aren't prophecy, the woman said. They're history. Your history, everyone's history, past, present, future, all happening now. December 21st is when the cycle resets, when the instructions activate, when someone has to choose. Choose what? Marcus stepped forward, his notebook clutched against his chest. Whether humanity remembers or forgets, whether you wake up or stay asleep, whether the timeline continues or... She gestured to the screens. They showed Denver, the city, but empty. Streets vacant. Building standing but lifeless, like everyone had just disappeared. That's not Denver, I said. That's not possible. It's Denver on December 22nd, if no one chooses, if the instructions aren't followed to the end. She walked back to the screens, touched one. It zoomed in on the airport, on Concourse B, on the spot where Marcus and I had been standing. But we weren't there. No one was there. The murals on the walls were blank, just empty frames. You have 3 days, she said, or 3 years, or -3 hours. Time is broken here. Has been since we built this place. The murals are the only constant, the only truth. Follow them to the end and you can fix it, or don't. And December 22nd becomes everyone's reality. How? Marcus demanded. How do we follow them to the end? The woman smiled, not the synchronized smile. A real one, sad, tired. You already are. You've been following them your whole life. Every choice, every delay, every moment that brought you here. It's all in the murals, your past, your future. You just have to. She paused, looked directly at me. Remember, and I did. I remembered being 7 years old, standing in this airport with my parents, looking at the murals for the first time. The figure in the corner, the one with my face. My parents couldn't see it, but I could. I drew it in my notebook when I got home. Drew the symbols, the patterns, the coordinates. I remembered being 17. Flying alone for the first time. The flight was delayed. I spent 6 hours studying the murals. Found the first hidden message. Told myself it was coincidence. I remembered being 27. 3 years ago, meeting Marcus for the first time. Right here. Having this exact conversation. Following the instructions. Coming to this room. Making the choice. I remembered choosing wrong. The cycle, I whispered. We've done this before. Many times, the woman confirmed. Each time you get closer. Each time you understand more. The murals update. Add new instructions based on what you learned, what you failed to learn. How many times? Marcus asked. Does it matter? This is the only time that counts. December 21st is always 3 days away, and you always have the same choice. She pointed to the far wall, a door I hadn't noticed before. Above it, painted directly on the concrete, was the final mural. One I'd never seen in the airport above. It showed two figures standing before a massive clock. The hands pointed to 3:33. One figure was reaching forward, about to move the hands. The other was walking away. "Choose," she said. "Reset the cycle and try again. Or walk away and let December 22nd arrive. Let humanity sleep forever. Let the empty world become real." Marcus looked at me. "We have to reset, try again, get it right next time." But I was tired. So tired. How many times had we done this? How many times had I stood in this room, faced this choice, failed to break the cycle? "What happens if we don't choose?" I asked. "If we just stay here?" The woman's smile faded. "Then you become us. The watchers, the recorders, waiting for the next ones to follow the instructions, hoping they'll be stronger, smarter, better." I looked at the synchronized people in their seats, watching the screens, humming their eternal song. Is that what happened to everyone who gave up? Who couldn't bear another cycle? "There's a third option," I said suddenly. "There has to be. The murals, they're not just instructions. They're a test. And we keep failing because we keep playing by the rules." I walked to the screens, touched one showing the first mural, the soldier in the gas mask. What if the instructions aren't about following? What if they're about breaking free? The room began to shake. The humming turned to screaming. The screens cracked, one by one, like ice under pressure. "You can't!" the woman shouted, but her voice was fragmenting. Multiple tones, multiple timelines. "The cycle must continue. December 21st must..." I grabbed Marcus's notebook, all his carefully documented patterns. 3 years of work, 3 years of cycles. I tore out the pages, let them fall like snow. "No more instructions," I said. "No more cycles. No more choosing between sleep and reset. We choose to wake up, really wake up. Now." The room exploded with light. I woke up in gate B42, my head on my backpack, my phone buzzing with a text. Flight 447 now boarding. I checked the time, 6:47 a.m., December 19th, 2024. Not 2025. 2024. The murals were there on the walls, but different. Faded. Like old photographs left in the sun. The hidden patterns were gone. The coordinates erased. Just paintings now. Just art. Marcus was nowhere to be found. When I asked the gate agent about overnight delays, she looked confused. "Sir, your flight is on time. Always has been." But I knew better. In my pocket, I found a single page from Marcus's notebook. One he must have saved, one I didn't throw away. It had just 4 words. "You broke the cycle." I boarded my flight, left Denver, left the murals behind. But sometimes, late at night, I Google them, look at the images tourists post, and every once in a while, in the corner of a photo, barely visible, I see a figure, small, almost hidden. It's always facing the camera, always pointing, not at something in the mural, at whoever's looking at the photo, at you. Because here's the thing about cycles. Breaking one just means starting another. And December 21st, it's not a date, it's a choice. A choice we all make, every day. Whether to follow instructions or forge our own path. Whether to sleep or wake up. Whether to see the patterns or ignore them. The Denver airport murals aren't prophecy. They're not warnings. They're mirrors. They show us what we expect to see, what we're ready to see. What do you see when you look at them, really look? Because Marcus was wrong about one thing. The instructions aren't for the chosen few who can see the patterns. They're for everyone. And you've been following them your whole life. You just didn't know it. Until now, sweet dreams. And next time you're in Denver International Airport, passing through those terminals in a hurry to make your connection. Maybe slow down. Maybe stop at the murals. Maybe look a little closer. Or maybe don't. Some instructions are better left unfollowed. Some cycles are better left unbroken. Some truths are better left sleeping. But you'll look now, won't you? You have to, because that's human nature. We see a door marked, "Do not enter," and we reach for the handle. We hear, "Don't look," and we turn our heads. We're told the murals are just art, and we start seeing the patterns. The choice is yours. It always has been. Just remember, December 21st is always 3 days away. Now, sleep. Or at least, try to. It's quiet now, too quiet, but not empty. That feeling crawling up your spine, that weight pressing on your chest, that's not your imagination. You're not alone. There's something behind the curtain. You haven't looked, not because you forgot, but because you're afraid to know. You heard the whisper, software wet, wrong. Like breath dragged across broken glass. But you told yourself it was the wind, didn't you? That lie made you feel safe. Temporarily. Let me ask you, does the wind whisper your name? Does the wind tap lightly, again and again, from the same spot, behind the curtain, every night? Does the wind leave scratches on your window that weren't there this morning? Thin, sharp, like claws, like warnings. You don't remember opening the window. You never open the window. But it's unlocked now. You could check, you could stand up, you could walk over and pull the curtain back. But you won't, because you know. You know what's waiting, not because you've seen it, but because you felt it. In the quiet, in the dark. Every time you close your eyes, every time you wake up and your blanket is just slightly moved. Your door slightly cracked. You try to explain it. Your mind wants to explain it. But that whisper, that sound that only comes when you're alone, when everything is still, when the night is at its deepest, that's not a dream, that's a presence. It doesn't want your fear, it wants your attention. It feeds on the moment you doubt yourself. The second you wonder if you heard something, the instant your heart rate rises. That's when it leans closer. It's been patient, watching, learning you like prey. You ever notice it never shows up when the lights are on, when someone's in the room? It waits for the ritual, the brushing of your teeth, the turning off of lights, the last look at your phone, the deep breath just before sleep. That's when it wakes up, that's when it stirs behind the curtain. Sometimes it watches you all night. Sometimes it moves. A shift in the shadow, a faint creak on the floorboards, the sound of fabric sliding over skin. And when you don't check, when you ignore it, that's when it comes closer. Not fast, not loud, just closer. You might feel a cold spot on the bed. You might feel breath on your neck. You might hear a whisper in your ear that sounds almost like your voice. It copies, it mimics, it blends, not to confuse you, to prepare you, because soon it won't need the curtain, it won't need shadows, it will sit beside you, stand behind you, speak through you. You won't even know when it happens. You'll wake up, look in the mirror, and something will be off. Your eyes won't blink quite right, your smile will linger too long. Your reflection will move just a little after you do. And the people around you? They'll say you seem different. Not worse, just not you. But tonight you're still you. Still in control, for now. You could still check. You could still confront it. Pull the curtain back, face it, but deep down, you've already made your choice. You won't. Because you'd rather lie still, let your eyes drift shut, and hope sleep comes quickly. And it will. But what you wake up as might not be the same. Now, if you've made it this far, congratulations. You're not just a viewer, you're part of something bigger. Something that watches with you, that sits beside you as you watch, as you listen, as you wait. Because this story doesn't end when the screen fades to black. It follows you into the next room, into your dreams, into your reflection. If you liked this story, like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss the next one, so we don't miss you, and comment below. Tell us the moment you stopped feeling alone. We're watching, we're listening, and we read everything. Now, go ahead, gain the courage to check the dark corners before you sleep. Turn off the lights, close your eyes, sleep well, if you can.